There was a guy named Michael McCormick who was going to give this talk, and his wife needed to have an emergency C-section. I don't think it was serious, but I think it's one of those things where you couldn't wait to be full term. So if everything goes well, they'll be leaving the hospital in 30 minutes. So on Monday, I found out I'm giving this talk. So here we are. My slides are nothing fancy, I'm sorry. I didn't have weeks to scour the internet for the spiciest memes and GIFs to show you, but we're gonna talk about Rails, and Rails is fun. So who here has made a non-trivial Rails app? Good amount of people. Also a good amount of people that didn't raise their hand, so that's good as well. So we're gonna talk about Rails today. Here's our talk structure. We're gonna do all the basic info bits, how you install it, talk about some core concepts, some stuff that I think is also important, but I didn't know how to name, and then we're gonna blow your mind with how easy it is to make an app and put it on the internet. Okay, so getting started. Rails was made by a guy named David Heinemeier, maybe it's Heinemeier Hansson, also known as DHH. And DHH is a funny guy. He is the co-founder of Basecamp, software you might have heard of. He is a class-winning Le Mans race car driver in his free time, picture on the left. He's kind of a thought leader type, if I can use that word in quotes. But he's a funny guy because he has very strong opinions, and he is not afraid to share those opinions. And then when he changes his mind on those, he's not afraid to stop talking about what he's talking about and then defend the other side just as strongly as before, like that was his original thing. So he's a funny guy to follow on Twitter. I kind of think of him like if Elon Musk was like not as rich and not as smart, and was like, instead of being a playboy, it's like, I got 10 million, life's good. Like, let's enjoy life. Obviously, he's smarter than me, so smart is a relative term there. But anyways, he's a funny guy, and I say that to say that his personality affected how Rails was developed because he was very integrated in the process, and his personality really comes through, which we'll talk about. Okay, so Rails is a Ruby gem, and if you don't know what a Ruby gem is, it is Ruby code that someone else has written and packaged up for you to use, just like NPM has a million things, Ruby Gems has a million things for you to use. It's a big project. You can see from the GitHub repo, almost 3,600 contributors, 70,000 commits. It's big. I think it's safe to say it's the biggest Ruby gem out there. Rails was created in 2004. DHH was working at his company Basecamp. It's a little logo on the top right. And he was making stuff and realized, like, I'm kind of doing the same thing over and over. A lot of people are doing these exact same things that I've been coding. And so he opened it up and gave us Rails. Initial release, 2004. Just for a little context, jQuery came 2 years after this, which kind of blows my mind. Like, Rails was there before jQuery was. So why did DHH create Rails? So this quote and these 9 bullet points are from this post on rubyonrails.org/doctrine. And it's this post by DHH. It's almost like an essay where he's explaining what Rails is about, why he made Rails. And the two that I think are the most important are these top two. And one is that Rails is optimized for programmer happiness. DHH was a guy who thought, you know, sometimes we make programming so hard, and we like that it's hard because it makes us feel good, like we're doing something hard. Like we have black and green terminals where we put all these archaic commands, and we have to memorize all this stuff, and it makes us like, hey, I'm doing something hard, I'm programming. And he's like, no, that's nonsense. Like, programming is about what you make, not how you make it. And a lot of people agree with that, a lot of people don't agree with that. But his idea behind Rails was like, we need to make programming fun, easy, and productive for everybody. The second biggest thing, which we'll see come up a lot, is that it adopted this mantra of convention over configuration. Similar to the same vein, I want to get stuff done. There's a lot of smart people who have figured stuff out. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Let's strictly stick to the conventions and the practices that they set up. Let's stand on their shoulders. And we're going to get down the road making what we need to make and not worry about all these little details that we're fighting over. So that's kind of the story behind Rails. If you have Ruby installed, installing Rails is very easy. It's just gem install Rails. This slide is kind of misleading because if you've never installed Ruby, it's not hard. It's definitely gotten a lot better, but There's a couple steps you need to follow, but overly not hard, but when you get to Rails, it's a one-liner. Okay, so let's talk about how you use Rails. So the main thing I want to focus on today, Rails is huge and you could have several talks on various pieces within Rails, but the main thing I want to focus is the request flow. So when somebody types in your app, facebook.com, and that URL request hits your server, the first thing that happens is the URL is matched against the router. And the router is this list of routes saying like, well, if they do /friends, send them here. If they do /photos, send them here. And so the URL is matched in the router, and the router calls a specific, what's called a controller and an action. So the router says they want to go here, here's the specific code that they need to run for this thing. And from there, the controller uses what's called a model to get the data, and it renders a view. Now I know if you don't know Rails, you don't know what any of these words mean, but I want to show you up front. Those are the 4 steps. We're going to go step by step and then look at it again. It'll make a lot of sense. Okay, so first up is the router. Now let's say you are trying to make reddit.com. If you're not familiar with Reddit, which would be shocking, it's a site that has posts. You make a user account, you make posts. If we were going to route this homepage, in Rails it would look something like this. So there's kind of 4 parts here. We've got the HTTP verb, so we're doing a GET, we're just requesting a resource, we're not posting anything, we're not deleting anything. And then the path is just /, so it's the root. This is the homepage. We're sending this to a controller, which is called home, and an action, which is called index. And we'll get to those in a second. Now, Reddit itself is made up of subreddits. One that I'm particularly fond of is Thanos Did Nothing Wrong, of which I am a child of Thanos in the great snappening. Thank you. If you don't know what this is, you need to go look at this because it's hilarious. Also, sorry, that's huge spoilers for Infinity War, but how have you not seen the movie? It's fantastic. That's on you. So, if we were going to model this subreddit, every subreddit starts with /r/ whatever the name is. Now, obviously, we don't want to have our routes file full of a million different hard-coded strings for every subreddit. That wouldn't be possible. So we need a dynamic segment, which is what the colon represents here. So anything that's /r/ whatever, grab that. That's our name. We're going to send it to a controller called subreddits and the show action. Now, this format is based on a concept called REST. REST is representational state transfer, but it's basically a way to describe asking for stuff on the web. So as Rails is heavy into convention over configuration, they said, we're going to adopt REST, routes are going to be RESTful, and we get a lot of things already kind of working for us. So in this routing table here, let's say we had a photography site and we had a resource photos. You're going to want to get all the photos, you're going to want to make new ones, you're going to update them, and delete them, and it shows a schema here based on the URL, based on the verb that you send, and then maps it to a controller and an action. Now, Rails is all about productivity and happiness. Nobody wants to type the same thing over and over and over. So if you have a resource that you can get all the things, make new things, update the things, delete the things, Rails says, just call it resources. So I could have resources of photos, or of users, or of subreddits, and Rails will automatically make all these routes. So like if you're doing basic RESTful things on this object, I got you, here's all your routes. Okay, so let's recap on the router real quick. The router matches an incoming URL and calls a specific controller and action based on the route that was matched. So we talked a lot about this controller, so let's look at that. The controller is really, it's a lot of the, the workhorse behind stuff that happens in Rails. So you intercept it in the router, sent to the controller, and then that's kind of where all this stuff happens from that point. So here's a very basic controller. We have, let's say, our home route, which is get / goes to a controller called home, and an action called index. And then below we see this is what that controller might look like. And as you can see, things kind of line up. We have a home controller, the name of the file is home_controller, the class is home controller, the action is index. So here, big time convention, the naming lines up. And inside of our index action, which is equivalent to a function in any other language, that's where all this stuff happens to make the homepage. If we do one thing real quick, this angle bracket application controller, if you're not familiar with Ruby, this is inheritance. Inheritance is a programming principle where if I make something that has this behavior, has this data and these attributes, and I say, I want all these things, and I want to like maybe specify them a little bit. So like if I make an animal, I might say, okay, this one has 4 legs, this one has 2, but I want all these other basic animal things. This is similar to what's happening here. We have this thing that Rails made called application controller, and it gives us all of our controlleriness type stuff, handling requests, handling params. And so we say, give me all that stuff, and then I'm going to make the index action and use a lot of that. So if we look at a subreddit example, here we have our same route that we talked about, and we see the same pattern here, where we're matching the names, we're matching the action, but we get our dynamic segment out by using this thing called the params, and this is the query parameters and the segment of the route. So in here we can actually get our subreddit name, and there's kind of these hidden objects, if you will. There's a lot of things in Rails that feel like magic. And there is a lot of magic, quote unquote. And that's really just code that someone else wrote that's working behind the scenes that you don't understand yet. And when you're first starting with Rails, it's kind of amazing because stuff just works. You name it the right way, set it up the right way, it's just like all this stuff happens. And over time, you'll start to learn more under the hood what's happening. But that's okay. Like if you're like, I don't know how this works, but it works, that's a great first step, because getting useful with the tool is what DHH really cared about. What is the new person experience? Like I want to go from 0 to app as fast as possible, and then later we'll figure out how it works. And so just for a little bit of context, there's these 3 objects that are available in a controller. One is the params, which you've seen, and the other is the response and the request, which, as they sound, the response you're going to send back, the request that you received. You probably won't deal with those until you get into making APIs or something more complex, but they're there. So if I throw the params, I basically raise the params of this route as an error, we can see that our data is inside of it. So we see that our subreddit name is Thanos did nothing wrong. Okay, so now we've got our data, we're inside of the controller, we want to make the page. So inside of our controller, we've got our params. Next, we're going to somehow load whatever it means to be the posts of this subreddit, and then we're going to render the HTML. And we'll get to that in a second, but let's recap the controller real quick. So the controller receives the request and the params from the router. It gets the data and whatever that looks like, and then it returns a response. That could be HTML, could be JSON, whatever you need. Okay, so it gets the data. How does it do that? In Rails, there is a concept known as a model. And a model is something that we think of even today in the real world. So we have a model train. It's a depiction of a real life thing, but at a different scale. And models in Ruby are depictions of real life things, but as code. And a model does a couple things. It models the data. It represents whatever you're trying to do. If you have a user model, it probably has a name. It probably has an email or an age. And in Rails, the model also deals with retrieving, manipulating, storing, and validating the data. And if you're a seasoned Rails person, you probably take a little bit of irk with that statement. But for a new person, the model deals with the data. Okay, so let's say we had a user model. It has a name, has an email, maybe it has a password and an age, and there's some way for them to make posts. One of the things we're going to be commonly doing on every model we have, users, posts, dogs, like whatever we end up creating for our app, is we're going to be validating data. Obviously, data is not useful if it's not right. It wouldn't make sense to have a person who didn't have a name or their age was a negative number. And then the other thing models are great for doing is they allow us to see the boundaries between other models. So what is the relationship between this data? How do I access things that are related to me? How do I update and store all this kind of stuff? Now, just like our controllers had application controller, which we got all this great stuff from, Models have what is called application record. You also will see a lot a term called active record, which for a new person's purposes, they're essentially the same. They switched the naming from Rails 4 to Rails 5 to use application record, which kind of sits on top of active record, so you can do fancier stuff if you need to, but for all intents and purposes, they're the same thing. So our model inherits from application record. And this gives us a lot of stuff. For example, our validation problem gives us really easy model validation. So we want this person to have a name. We can easily say, validates name, presence true. Or, okay, well, let's look at how that plays out real quick. So one of the commands that you have in your Rails executable when you install it is the console. And this boots up a Ruby session and loads all of your Rails stuff inside of it. And so if we make a new user, which is the first line, so we'll say u equals user.new, see that we have a user object that has nothing filled out. It's got a couple fields like a name and an age, and then a created and an updated timestamp. If we ask to validate our model, so we say u.validate, it says it's false. And then if we check the errors, we can see that saying, hey, your name can't be blank. Now if we try to validate age, we can say, validate that our age is between 1 and 120. That's a reasonable age range. Similar thing, create a new user, give them a name Bob and an age of 150, which we're not allowing. If we try to validate them, it says it doesn't work. And then again, we can see, hey, age is not included in the list. You can also specify a specific message. Maybe you want to say, please enter a valid age. The user is probably not going to know what age is not included in the list means. So another thing that active record gives us is a lot of querying power. So we talked about our RESTful routes. We're going to be getting a lot of stuff. We're going to be making new stuff, updating it, deleting it. And we're going to do this for every model. So if we write this one time for users, get all of my users. Like, oh, now we have posts. Okay, get all of my posts. Oh, I need to delete this user. I need to delete this post. We're going to have a lot of shared code just all over the place, everywhere. And so Active Record provides these really great query methods that are automatically injected into your model when you inherit from it. And these are really, really easy to use. So if you want all the users, user.all, user.find, user.update, user.delete. And so it gives us an abstraction away from our database layer. If you are not strong in SQL, you don't have to worry about how do I do this query? How do I take this query data and hydrate it into an object that I can use in Ruby land? Active Record takes care of all that for you. Active Record is what we call an ORM, which is an object relational mapping. Basically means like whatever persistence you have underneath your app, Postgres database, MySQL, some type of cache, you call up some dude and have him like write it down on a piece of paper. Whatever it is, you use your adapter for Active Record, and it says, okay, I got it. I know how to get these things, save them, update them, delete them, and give you back Ruby. An example of this, if we're going to create a user, we can say user.create, pass in our data, and then we can see that it translates our Ruby code into SQL, inserts it in the database, and then gives us a new user object back in Ruby. Same thing with user.all. The user.all makes our classic select all query in SQL, and then returns an object called an active record relation, which is basically a fancy array, and gives us all of our users back. Yes? Why did it have the limit? So the question is, why is the limit on there? I believe Rails has some defaults. If you're wanting, I'm playing in the console, so it may be treated differently. Let's say you had, 1 million users. It's not going to try and load 1 million users into memory and put it in your console, because that just wouldn't work. So there's kind of some self-imposed limits. You can do a lot of stuff with Active Record. This is kind of the most complex but still readable example I wanted to show. I mean, if you want to get joins and groupings and all kinds of stuff in here, you can do that, but very easy to chain together what you want. So here, in this example, we're looking for users who are named Bob, who are over 25 years of age. We're ordering them by their created at descending, meaning give me the most recent person who signed up, who's named Bob, over age 25, and give me the first 5. Okay, so recap on the model. The model is all about the data. It's about validating it, persisting it, querying it, how this data plays with other pieces of data. And it inherits from application record, and that gives it a lot of power. Okay, on to the last piece. This is tying it all together, the view. The view is the stuff you see, obviously. This is the HTML that creates the page for us. So if we look at a sample view maybe, so we've got a title, we've got 2 divs that represent posts with an image and a title and a description. Now back in the controller, we found our subreddit name. And so the controller takes the data and passes it to the view. So we can find our subreddit using an active record query method called findBy. So we find a subreddit by its name, and that returns our subreddit object, which we store as an instance variable. So basically we're saying, make this accessible to my view, and that's represented by the @ sign. So now, okay, so real quick we need to talk about ERB. All view files are like index.html.erb, and ERB stands for embedded Ruby. Embedded Ruby is just a way to put logic into your views, and this is common among many templated languages. But the way you use ERB is if you start something with angle bracket %equals, it will evaluate the code and then put it into the page at that spot. If you don't use the equals, it will just run the code. And that may be a little confusing, but if you look at this example, it's pretty clear. So instead of saying hard-coded text, r/Thanos did nothing wrong, we can now say, here's where the subreddit name is supposed to be. We use the equals because we actually want to put that into the page, and we access the name property or method off of our subreddit object, which we made in the controller. And then instead of statically putting all these divs, we can now loop over all of the posts of our subreddit. So we can say subreddit.posts.each, and for each post, we make the relevant div with its dynamic image, dynamic title, dynamic description. Okay, so coming back to our request flow, this should now make sense. Request comes in. The URL is matched by the router. The router calls a specific controller an action, and then the controller uses a model to get the data and then renders the view. Okay, so there's our core concepts. Let's make an app. So the first thing you do, you call Rails new and then whatever you want to name your project. And as you can see from the screenshot, it makes a lot of files. And we've talked about most of those, but there's a couple more that I want to mention before we get into the actually making of it. So one important one is the Gemfile. And the Gemfile is a file of gems, like its name sounds. This is some of the default gems that come in a Rails project. So you obviously want to use Rails in your Rails project. It has a Postgres adapter, if that's the database that you chose. It has our web server, and then it has stuff for like asset management. So if you want to use SAS, there's a gem for that. If you want to compress your JavaScript, you can do that. And this is very similar to like a package.json type thing. If you're in JavaScript land, this is just where all of your code from other people is being managed. Okay, like we said, Rails is about conventions. Now, if you look at some of these files, you'll notice that they have a very specific structure. It's models.post, lowercase, singular. It's resources, :posts, single, or plural, and lowercase. We have post controller, which is also plural, but we saw in the controller that the name of the class is actually capital. And when you're first starting in Rails, this can kind of be like, how do I keep all this together? Like the naming allows it to tie all of its magic together, and so it can be very confusing. But Rails is optimized for programmer happiness. So they said, you don't need to remember all that stuff. We have generators. So if you wanted to make a controller, you can use the command Rails generate controller, give it the controller name, and then the action. And then it makes all that stuff for you. Similarly, if you wanted a model, you can do the same thing. Rails generate model, user name being a field, age being a field. By default, they're strings. Let's make age an integer. And it makes all the fields for that. Now, Rails is like, okay, that's too much typing. 2 commands? No, we need 1 command. And so you have it. It's called scaffold. if you wanted to make a post resource, you can scaffold post and give it the fields you want, and it will make something called a migration, the model, the controller, the tests, the helpers. Aaron, question. That was an excellent question. What does the G mean? G is a shortcut for generate. So Rails G model, Rails generate model, same thing. Thank you for asking. So scaffold makes all this stuff for you, which is great. And if you're like, oh man, I typed post wrong, or I did it lowercase, there's also Rails destroy commands, and so you can just like revert back, try again, scaffold everything again. Okay, so there's one file that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the migration file. So let's talk about migrations. Now, when we write apps, we probably have commits, incremental blocks of work that we say, okay, I want to save this, commit it, push it up, everyone else can pull it down, now we're all in the same spot. Well, you need the same thing for your database changes. You don't want to be just on the fly editing your database because one, you're affecting live data, and two, if someone else is working on your app, they don't know what you've done. If I want to work on your app, you're like, well, okay, so first I made a user table, actually I renamed that field, oh no, I dropped that one, then I made a post. Like we need a systematic way to say, here's a fresh database with nothing, and then here's where we're at now, and to be able to roll through those changes. And so that's where migrations come in. So when you generate a model, it makes a migration file. A model is not going to be super useful if you can't persist the data in your database. So here's an example of what one of those migration files would look like. It's under the db migrate folder, and then that string of numbers at the top is the timestamp when you ran the command. And then Rails tries to give it a useful name, so it's calling this create users. So we can see that this file is a Ruby class. It inherits from active record migration, and it's got a method or a function called change. And so this function takes Ruby code and again translates it into SQL. So in this file, we are creating a table called users, and we're specifying all the columns that we want the table to have. So to use this, first we need to create a database. Every time you make a new project, one of the first things you'll do is run Rails db create. After that, we make our model, and then there's a command called migrate, which will run the migration. Now, migrations are run one time. So if you run db migrate again, it'll do nothing because the database is already in a proper state. Someone on your team makes a new migration, pushes it up, you pull it down, you run migrate again, and then you move forward a step. And it does this based on the timestamp. So it keeps track locally. Here's the last timestamp of the migration I ran, so it knows whether it's current or not. Yes? Is there also, the question is there also a migrations table? So there's a file called schema in a Rails project that I believe keeps the timestamp inside of that file. We can look at that in a second, actually. If that makes, I'll show you in a second. Remind me if I forget. Okay, so example time. We're going to play a little game called how many commands do I need to run to get from no app to live app on Heroku, assuming I have everything installed. I'm now receiving guesses. 3. Anyone else? 1. It is more than 1 because the first command is Rails new. So 3 is the leading number to guess. Aaron, guess. 18? Okay. Anyone else? That's a wide range. You could come in right in the middle and you might win. 7 and 5. All right, let's do this. Rails new. Give me a project name. Excellent. Thanos did nothing wrong. 1. Made all of our stuff. We're going to CD into that project. Okay. That is number 2. Did I make that? My volume's off. These don't count. I'm just going to open up the project and show you what we're working with. Okay, so now we have a blank Rails project. Here's the routes file, and there's nothing in there. I think at this point we actually don't even have a schema. Yeah, we don't have a schema yet. But if we look over here, we have no controllers, we have no models, we have no views. Okay, so the title is so long it's going to break all the commands onto a new line. Okay, so now what we're going to make is a user management app. So what command do we want to use? Anyone want to take a guess? We're using the least amount of commands possible. I'll give you a hint. It starts with Rails G, scaffold, user. We're going to give him a name and an age, which is an integer. Okay, so made all this stuff. Now we need to make a database. So Rails DB create. Made our database. Now what do we need to do? Migrate is correct. If I can spell it right. Okay, so we have made our table. Now if I refresh my routes file, we see that it added this resources user. Refresh this guy. Now we have a user model. Has nothing in it. We have a user's controller, which actually has a lot of stuff in it. So we have an index action. We're using our basic active record query methods here. For the index action, we get all of them. For show, I wonder why show is not implemented. That's odd. We're going to make a new one. We're going to create, and this is like, it's kind of like eye-jarring, but it says like, okay, maybe you want to return JSON, but we don't. So anyways, here's our update method, which really like this is one line. It's user update user params, and then did it work or did it not? And then we have our delete. Okay, so what I'm going to do, so next we need to commit our changes, which I couldn't find a way to do this in one like true command. I was kind of surprised. Commit those. Going to make a new app on Heroku. And I'm going to do git push Heroku master. And while that is doing its thing, hopefully the internet stays up, I'm going to boot it up locally using the Rails server command. And we'll look at what we made. Okay, it's on localhost 3000. We're on Rails. Okay, but this is the default page we get for Rails. Our actual app is located at 3000/users. So here we are. This is all generated by the scaffold. So we say, here's Bob. He's 25. That is yes, thank you. It has to do that with the volume off. Doesn't make any sense. Anyways. So here we have our users. Say like, I don't know, Bob, you're not 25, you're 75. Update him. Got a new user, Susan. She's 114. Okay, so we have a working user management. Let's go ahead and destroy just for the fun. All right there. Okay. Now we have created our Heroku app. We've pushed it up. So if I go to Heroku open, it says the page you're looking for does not exist, and that's because we have not set up a root route. So we go to users, and it says, oh no, something went wrong. So what do we forget to do on Heroku? Migrate is correct. Heroku run Rails DB migrate. Do. All right. Boom. On the internet, if you went to intense-hollows-35819.herokuapp.com/users, you could be putting in live users right now. Do the same thing. Bob. There we are. From nothing to app that makes users. My count is 10 commands. So person that said 7, I'll give you a high five later. Way to be. So there it is. Make the new app, get in there, scaffold the stuff, set up the database, commit the stuff, get it on Heroku. Easy. That is the epitome of the power of Rails. Like stuff just works. You do it, you follow their convention, it's magic. Obviously there's a simple example, but show me another framework that does that. And we'll fight with our frameworks. So that's where I'm going to call it for here. Rails is a huge project and has a lot of stuff. A couple things I wanted to mention. It has a built-in testing story. So when there's that barf of files that come out when you generate, a lot of those are tests. Unit tests, integration tests, all kinds of stuff. Rails is also great at handling relationships. So a user has many posts, a post has many comments, comment has many upvotes. That can be kind of a mess to handle data-wise when you get into like the creating, deleting, updating stuff. Makes it really easy. Rails is also still actively being maintained. I think version 6 is like approaching release, if I'm correct. But they're trying to stay relevant with the pace that development happens. So something they added in Rails 5 is something called Action Cable, and it allows for socketing. So if you want to stream live results, you can do that. Lots of other stuff. I mean, you could do an entire talk on Action Cable or testing or relationships. And we might have one actually scheduled for that, but yeah. So if you want to learn Rails, I highly, highly recommend this book. It is free. It's called The Rails Tutorial by Michael Hartle. This is how I originally learned Rails. There's a guy named Ryan LeBeau who was like, hey man, we need to do this Rails thing. So he had the video cast when we went to his house. It took us like an hour to get Ruby and Rails set up because it was kind of painful back in the day. But the book is free. He tries to sell you a lot of stuff like videos and like, hey, here's my CSS course, here's my JavaScript course. And I mean, good for him. He's probably helped like tens of thousands of people learn Rails. This book is incredible. When I went through it, you rebuilt a Twitter clone. I don't know what the exact example is now, but yeah, it's awesome. Okay, with that, thanks. If you want to find me, I'm at John Mosesman pretty much everywhere. And let's have some questions. I forgot, you mentioned one thing. Let me go back to that. So you said, where is the migration format kept? Right, so there's this. Right. Good question. How does the database know where it's at in its migrations? And so there's this file that's created the first time you make anything database related called schema.rb. Oh, that's kind of hard to read with font that big. And so we see right here, like here, well, let's look at it real quick. So I'm using a database that I've made like a million random one-off projects, which is why you see all these kind of random tables in here. But why does it do that? But so you see right here, here's the version. This timestamp right here correlates to our create users.
I think exactly. Is there a table in the database that corresponds to that version?
There isn't a table, but it knows based on this file that this timestamp is the last one I've run.
How does it handle migrations? How does it handle the user migrations table? Migrated it versus your coworker or whatever.
Oh, so you're saying how
So like if
I set up a new project.
You pull it down, you don't need to migrate it again. because
Right.
it's in the database.
Right, so the question is, how do you know? So it says that the migration stamp is here, and I start a new project. How does my local setup know where it's at? Someone said there's a migration.
There's a schema migration table that keeps track of all migrations that are already run.
Okay, so yes, I think what you said, there is a migrations table that says, here's where I'm at.
It keeps track of all the timestamps of all your migration files, and whichever ones are in the table have already been run. If that's not the table, it hasn't been run.
Gotcha, so saying if has a table that keeps track of them, if the timestamp is in there, then you've obviously run it. If it's not, then it continues to run it. I learned something today myself.
There's a rake task that helps you.
There's a rake task. So, that's a good kind of a side point. Rails from 4 to 5 kind of switched its naming convention a little bit. So there's all these Rails commands, Rails server, Rails G, model, Rails console. And before those were all called rake, which I think is after Ruby, basically like Ruby make, like the Ruby version of CMake. But now they're all called Rails. So if you see documentation that says Rails DB migrate versus rake DB migrate, those are the same.
Does a template come with Ruby, or is that something?
Like the install process.
Yeah.
So,
There's a thing called Gem.
right.
That's
So when you install, so the question is, how does this gem command work? Where does that come from?
yeah, where's it coming
So when you install Ruby, you're installing an executable for a thing that knows how to talk to a website / it's like npm, but it's called rubygems.org. And so the gem executable knows how to communicate with that, and that's where all the actual gems themselves are hosted. Other questions? Good questions. Okay, thank you.